Hello, everybody. Matter of course, generational trauma. A subject often relegated to the footnotes, yet one that arguably underpins the entire human narrative. You don't often find it in the neat timelines of kings and treaties, but it's there, humming beneath the surface of every census record, every ledger, every silent family portrait. Generational trauma is not an event, it is the lingering atmospheric pressure after the storm has passed, shaping the climate for those who never felt the initial rain. A historian does not speak of ghosts but of legacies. We trace the vector of suffering not through a family's DNA, but through its documented behaviors, its economic choices, its silences. Consider the most tangible example the institution of chattel slavery. The historical record is clear on its economic and political facts, but the trauma is found in the interstices. It is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which legally mandated that the terror of pursuit was perpetual, a policy that institutionalized paranoia. It is the post Reconstruction era's Great Migration, years 1960 to 1970, not merely a search for economic opportunity, but a mass frantic exodus from the pervasive threat of lynching and Jim Crow. A flight that severed roots and scattered kinship networks, a wound that manifests in displacement. This trauma is inherited. It is the parent who, having grown up under the constant threat of violence, teaches their child a hypervigilance that can be misread as hostility. It is the economic precarity passed down not just through stolen wages and denied land ownership, but through a learned aversion to financial risk, a completely rational fear of systems that have always been predatory. We see it in the census data showing wealth gaps that persist for centuries. That it's not an accident. It is the arithmetic of inherited disadvantage. But we must not be myopic. This pattern repeats across the human spectrum. The Irish immigrant family of the 19th century, fleeing famine, a trauma of starvation and powerlessness, often exhibited a hoarding mentality around food and a deep seated distrust of authority for generations. We can find evidence in personal diaries, recipes that stretch meager ingredients, stories passed down that emphasize the hungry time. So, the survivors of the Great Depression, 1929 to the late 1930s, ingrained in their children and grandchildren a pathological fear of financial instability. This is not a simple lesson, it is a psychological imprint. We see it in the hoarding of tangible goods, the preference for cash over credit, the deep anxiety around employment, behaviors that seem irrational to later generations who did not live through the collapse, but are logical outcomes of that historical experience. Even on a global scale, the trauma of World War II did not end in 1945. The children of Holocaust survivors of soldiers with what was then called shell shock, of civilians who endured bombardment, they grew up in homes shaped by a silence that was louder than any scream. They inherited a baseline of anxiety, a subconscious expectation of catastrophe, a relationship with authority and safety that was irrevocably fractured. This is documented in psychological studies beginning in the 1960s, but the anecdotal evidence is vast and heartbreaking. Both of my parents were born in the 1960s, in the early 1960s. And I wrote about this today because all the trauma that I've experienced in my life, because I am an African American female, and because I was raised by my parents and the siblings that I have, and the family that I have, I realize it every day that there were no emotions being shown back then. You didn't get to say, hey, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling suicidal. You had to suck it up and you had to keep on going through your life. That was just the end of it. End of story. You didn't get to talk about your emotions, or you got physically abused, emotionally abused, psychologically imprinted and abused. The historian's role is to connect the policy to the person. The Trail of Tears from 1830 to 1850 was not a single event. It was the beginning of a legacy of land loss, cultural disintegration, and health disparities that reverberates in Native American communities today. The data is clear. Lower life expectancy, higher rates of addiction. These are not cultural traits, they are the somatic symptoms of historical injury. the body politic still expressing 8 centuries old pain. In conclusion, to ignore generational trauma is to read a history book with only every other page. It is the missing variable in the equation of why certain patterns of poverty, of health, of conflict persist long after the originating statues are repealed and the battlefields are turned into monuments. Excuse me. We are not just living in our own time, we are living in the accumulated emotional residue of all time that came before us. The past is never dead, it's not even past. It is a weight passed from one hand to the next, and the historian's job is to measure its mass. It's fascinating. At least I believe it is. This single query could branch into 100 monographs. The generational trauma of the Dust Bowl, of the Vietnam War, of the HIV/AIDS crisis. The data streams are endless. The patterns are in everywhere around us and everything around us.